This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, this is a tough episode, but it happened, and it's an important piece of the puzzle when trying to understand just how forcefully the effects of the Satanic Panic swept across America and the world. For all the parents out there sending their kids off to school this week, think back to that first day of preschool, that first day of expensive, scary preschool. And I mean scarier for the parents than for the kids. I remember hiding behind a hedge with my wife, trying to see how our kid would react to being without us for the first time. And we weren't alone there. There were 3 other parent couples behind that hedge, just making sure that, the kid was okay. I mean, we were fine. We were just concerned for our children. And you know what? They were okay. It wasn't perfect, but really, what is? It was the first letting go in what is a series of successive and increasingly more serious letting goes in the lives of our kids. Elementary school drop-offs, athletic activities, sleepovers, summer camps, first dates, college. It makes me want to sit in a corner and cry. But hey, that's parenting. And the consistent element to nearly all of the events I just mentioned is that there is an adult that isn't you who is temporarily in charge of the safety of your children. And that's where the fear comes in. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Back to School, a history of the Satanic Panic, Part 2. In September of 1983, more than 200 current and former parents of a Southern California preschool received a letter in the mail that, as a parent, must have felt like getting hit by a Mack truck. This letter basically announced that a teacher at the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, a high-end seaside community along the coast in southern Los Angeles County, this teacher had been accused of physical and sexual abuse, and police wanted the parents of former students to try and find out if their kids were also victims. Yeah, you can imagine how those parents must have felt. The letter read, in part, "Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime, or if he or she has been a victim, including oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of, quote, taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing." So how many parents do you think drove to the school with violence on their minds? Right? Lots. But although justified, their anger was in good hands, as the LAPD, the detective squad, and the LA County District Attorney's Office, headed up at the time by Ira Reiner, spared no expense in investigating and ultimately prosecuting the case. But how did it all start? In late summer 1983, Judy Johnson, the mother of one of the McMartin Preschool's newest students, called the police to report that her 2.5-year-old son had been sodomized by McMartin teacher Ray Bucky. Ray was in his mid-20s at the time and had literally grown up in the school. He was the grandson of the school's founder, Virginia McMartin, and the son of the headmistress, Peggy McMartin Bucky. Mrs. Johnson alleged that her son began having painful bowel movements and had made vague references to Mr. Ray touching him and, quote, taking his temperature. But the allegations only became more intense and more strange. Dozens of parents responded to the letter they received, alerting law enforcement that they could have dozens of victims of the McMartin Preschool. And Ray Bucky wasn't the only alleged perpetrator. The district attorney's office contracted with a Los Angeles-based nonprofit called the Children's Institute International, or the CII, a well-known abuse therapy clinic, and they were going to handle the interviews with the children who had indicated that they might be a victim. CII was instrumental in developing techniques that made it easier and safer for children to relay information that might otherwise be too painful or too confusing to talk about. Or they might be too scared to talk about it for fear that they did something wrong. CII was among the first to effectively use hand puppets that could be ascribed silly voices and mannerisms that would then be used as disassociative measures to allow kids an emotional buffer to talk freely about what had happened to them, using the hand puppets as proxies. And the results were astonishing and horrifying. More than 360 children were identified as victims with abuses ranging from sodomy, which examiners claimed could be proven with photographic evidence of scarring on some of the children, also ritualistic abuse, witnessing of orgies at car washes, torture in secret rooms and tunnels beneath the school, and nude pornographic photography that the staff referred to as a game called Naked Movie Star. One 5-year-old claimed he saw an infant get beheaded, and several told the same stories about animal sacrifices. So, as stated, by now it wasn't just Ray Buckey that was among the accused. Ray was already in jail, and on March 22, 1984, he was joined by his grandmother, Virginia McMartin, his mother, Peggy McMartin Buckey, his sister, Peggy Ann Buckey, and his colleagues at the preschool, Mary Ann Jackson, Betty Rader, and Babette Spittler. Together, they were charged with 115 counts of child abuse, but that was quickly expanded to 321 counts involving 48 children. Judy Johnson, the original accuser, continued to provide information to investigators. But her statements were getting more and more, let's say, bizarre by the day. She once claimed that Ray Buckey could fly because he had made some kind of deal with the devil, and that every single kid in that school knew it, but they were just too scared to say. By this point, the book, Michelle Remembers, the subject of our previous episode, had gained global fame, and the idea of satanic ritual abuse against children was accepted as a very real danger. In fact, Dr. Pazder and Michelle Smith actually consulted with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office on the McMartin preschool case. But despite this, prosecutors didn't for a second believe that Ray Buckey could fly or that he was possessed by Satan. They did recognize that they had a problem in the person of Judy Johnson, a pretty big one. They would need to figure out if her mental state caused this whole mess or if her mental state was caused by this whole mess. Eventually, they concluded that she had indeed been deeply affected by the harm done to her child, and that, despite the bizarre claims, her testimony was still material to their case. And what a case it was to be. The preliminary hearings alone lasted 20 months. It was during these hearings that the prosecution laid out their theory for satanic ritual abuse, and dozens of children provided testimony. By the time 1986 rolled around, District Attorney Ira Reiner took a good long look at the evidence and decided, there's just not enough to convict anyone except Ray Buckey and his mother Peggy. So the other 5 co-defendants had their charges dropped and were released. Now, unfortunately for the prosecution and the Johnson family, in December of 1986, just 7 months before the trial was set to begin, Judy Johnson, the woman responsible for the entire case, was found dead in her apartment in Manhattan Beach. The cause of death was acute alcohol poisoning. Her family made a statement explaining that Judy had struggled with alcoholism for most of her adult life. So now it was up to the DA's office to get some justice for these kids and to hopefully stem the rising tide of Satanism that was threatening to take over the country. but they may have been too late. A year prior to Judy Johnson's bombshell allegations, a strikingly similar situation was playing out a few hundred miles north of Los Angeles in Kern County. Although the McMartin case in Los Angeles commanded national news coverage, the Kern County case came first and is actually credited with starting what became a disturbing string of cases involving satanic ritual abuse in preschool and daycare centers across North America. It all began in Kern County in 1982, when the two young daughters of Alvin and Debbie McEwen alleged that they had been abused by their parents. Full disclosure, the McEwen household had its difficulties, so much so that custody of the children had been granted to the girls' step-grandmother, a woman named Mary Ann Barber. It was Miss Barber who alerted the police as to these allegations, which were extremely graphic and included the accusation that the McEwens were members of a satanic sex ring operating in the area. And the kids also implicated the parents of their friends, two boys whose parents were Scott and Brenda Niffen. Based on the testimony of their own children, the McEwens and the Niffens were arrested, tried, and convicted in 1984 and given a combined sentence of over 1,000 years in prison. And further, in Kern County alone, there were 6 similar cases in just the next 2 years. In one case, 5 young boys testified against 4 defendants, all accused of membership in a satanic cult that preyed on young children. All 4 were convicted, with local carpenter John Still receiving a 40-year sentence. In all the Kern County cases, the social workers assigned had all attended a training seminar that made them aware of satanic ritual abuse, how to spot it, and how to deal with the victims. One of the books used in the training was called Michelle Remembers, by Dr. Lawrence Pazder and Michelle Smith. Further, within the next 5 years, there were serious cases in daycares resulting in multiple convictions in Massachusetts, Tennessee, the Bronx, New Jersey, San Francisco, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, Washington State, and a handful of cities in Canada and as far away as New Zealand. In every case, there were elements of satanic ritual abuse, and trained workers or law enforcement officers conducted interviews with child victims. All of these cases resulted in convictions and long prison sentences because the children were believed. And why was this the case? I'm not saying that children's testimony was generally not believed before this, but belief in the testimony of allegedly abused children was especially important during this outbreak of abuse in preschools and daycare centers. And the reason is because of a coalition of parents from the McMartin preschool case. A number of parents of victims began a movement entitled Believe the Children. It was an important group for a number of reasons, not the least of which was educating the public as to what satanic ritual abuse was and just how much danger our children were in on a daily basis. But mostly, they served to remind us all, especially law enforcement, to believe the children. And they were very effective. As noted earlier, there were hundreds of convictions for satanic ritual abuse in daycares and preschools across North America throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Careers were made, children were saved, and the public became more educated to this clear and present danger affecting the youth of America. The strength and efficacy of the Believe the Children movement even caught the attention of Washington, D.C. Several lawmakers there had for years sought a way to protect our nation's youth even more. I mean, they wanted to protect the crap out of an entire generation. And from what, you ask? Well, from music, of course. Really subversive stuff like Prince, Madonna, AC/DC, Ozzy Osbourne, Twisted Sister, NWA, and during the conservative wave headed up by President Ronald Reagan, the political climate in America was just ripe enough to maybe get some traction when it came to protecting the kids. Some might call it censorship. Well, a lot of people did actually call it censorship. They called it censorship during hearings in the halls of Congress. But these protectors would not be denied. They boldly claimed the rights of parents everywhere to monitor what their children listened to, what the so-called musicians called art. So, if not the actual politician, the wives of several prominent politicians teamed up and formed what they called the Parents Music Resource Center. And they would go to any lengths to save the children from themselves. More on the history of the Satanic Panic next time. Stick around. And thanks for listening. Be sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and now full episodes available on YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.